The soft hum of a piano melody filled the elegant dining room of Pemberton Bistro, a fine dining gem in the heart of Portland, Oregon. The late afternoon sunlight streamed through the restaurant's expansive windows, casting a warm golden glow over the neatly set tables and well-dressed patrons. It was the kind of place where life's milestones were celebrated, where whispered conversations of success mingled with the delicate clinking of wine glasses. Amid the gentle hustle of servers balancing trays and attending to their guests, the entrance door swung open. The figure who stepped inside was unassuming, yet commanding in her quiet presence. An elderly black woman, poised and graceful, walked in with steps measured and deliberate. She wore a navy blue coat, its cuffs delicately embroidered, and carried a small black handbag that seemed to contain not just her belongings, but years of untold stories. Her back was straight, her chin held high. There was a calm authority in her expression, a strength born of experience. The hostess at the podium greeted her with a professional smile, though there was a flicker of something unspoken in her eyes, a subtle hesitation. "Do you have a reservation, ma'am?" she asked, her tone polite, but with a slight edge that was difficult to place. "Yes," the woman replied, her voice steady and calm. "Under the name Mrs. Holloway." The hostess scanned her reservation list and nodded, gesturing for Mrs. Holloway to follow. She led her through the bustling room, past tables filled with laughter and animated conversations, to a small corner near the kitchen. It wasn't the best seat in the house, not by a long shot. But Mrs. Holloway said nothing. She simply nodded her thanks and took her seat, smoothing the napkin onto her lap as her eyes swept over the menu. Minutes passed, then more. Nearby, other diners received warm, cheerful service, their orders taken promptly, their glasses filled before they could even ask. But for Mrs. Holloway, the attention never came. Her assigned waiter, a tall man in his late 20s named Todd, seemed to avoid her table altogether. When he did finally approach, his tone was curt, his demeanor indifferent. "Sorry for the wait," he said, his smile thin and perfunctory. "We're really busy right now. I'll be back to take your order in a bit." Mrs. Holloway, ever composed, nodded gracefully. "Take your time," she said with a faint smile, her voice betraying none of the unease she must have felt. But as Todd walked away, he didn't hurry. Instead, he stopped at the next table, laughing and chatting with the diners there, as if Mrs. Holloway were invisible. Across the room, subtle glances were exchanged. Some patrons noticed the disparity in how she was being treated, though no one spoke up. A whisper here, a raised eyebrow there. It was clear something was amiss, but the room remained largely silent. The moments stretched into what felt like an eternity. Mrs. Holloway's water glass remained empty. Her napkin, neatly folded, sat untouched as she waited with quiet patience. Todd passed her table several more times, each time finding a reason not to stop. At another table, a young couple whispered to each other, "Why hasn't she been served yet?" The woman murmured, glancing discreetly toward Mrs. Holloway. Her partner shrugged, his expression uneasy. Unbeknownst to everyone, someone else was watching. Someone who had been following every slight, every dismissive glance. From a table near the bar, a man in his late 30s sat observing the scene with growing tension. Dressed in a crisp navy blazer, he exuded a quiet authority that seemed at odds with his relaxed posture. His eyes, sharp and attentive, remained fixed on Todd. This man was Elijah Holloway, the owner of Pemberton Bistro. And Mrs. Holloway. She wasn't just another diner, she was his mother. Elijah had built this restaurant from the ground up, pouring his heart and soul into every detail. Yet here he sat, watching his mother, his anchor, his inspiration, being treated as though she didn't belong. But Elijah wasn't one to act impulsively. He had learned the power of patience, of letting the truth reveal itself. For now, he remained silent, his fingers tapping lightly against his glass as he waited to see just how far Todd would go. The anger simmering inside him was carefully contained, but his jaw tightened each time Todd ignored Mrs. Holloway's table. The room grew quieter as the tension became impossible to ignore. Conversations faltered, and more diners began to notice the glaring oversight. Yet Todd seemed oblivious, or worse, unconcerned. When Mrs. Holloway finally raised her hand to signal him, her voice was soft yet firm. "Excuse me," she said, her words cutting through the subdued murmur of the room. Todd turned, his irritation barely concealed. "Yes," he said curtly. "I'd like to place my order now, if you're not too busy," she said, her calm demeanor unwavering. Todd sighed, glancing around as though searching for an escape. "I'll be back in a minute," he muttered before walking away without another word. At that moment, Elijah Holloway pushed back his chair, rising to his feet with a deliberate calm. The room seemed to shift as he made his way across the restaurant, his gaze locked on Todd. The casual arrogance on Todd's face melted into confusion as he noticed Elijah approaching. "Hey, Elijah," Todd stammered, forcing a smile. "I didn't know you were here." "I've been here," Elijah replied, his voice calm but laced with unmistakable authority. "And I've been watching." Todd's smile faltered. "Watching what?" Elijah's eyes flicked toward his mother's table, then back to Todd. "Watching you ignore my mother," he said, his tone sharp and unyielding. "The woman you thought didn't deserve the same respect as everyone else in this room." The restaurant fell silent. Even the pianist paused, his fingers hovering above the keys. All eyes were now on Elijah and Todd, the weight of the moment hanging heavily in the air. What happened next would not only leave Todd stunned, but would also serve as a powerful reminder to everyone present, a lesson about dignity, respect, and the quiet strength of those who refuse to be diminished. The silence in the restaurant was deafening, broken only by the faint clatter of a fork dropping at a nearby table. Todd stood frozen, his face flushing as the weight of Elijah's words settled over him. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. The gaze of every diner in the room was now locked on him, waiting to see how he would respond, or if he even could. Mrs. Holloway sat in her corner, her face composed, but her eyes betraying a quiet sadness. She had endured moments like this before, moments where her dignity had been quietly challenged and where silence often felt like the safest choice. She had learned to hold her head high, to let the world see her grace, even when it refused to grant her the same. But this time felt different. This time, a son was standing before her, drawing a line in the sand. Elijah, still calm, but with an unmistakable edge to his tone, took a step closer to Todd. "Do you have any idea who she is?" he asked, his voice firm yet even. His words were not shouted, but they carried a weight that filled the room. Todd stammered, his confidence rapidly unraveling. "I didn't mean to. I didn't realize." He trailed off, glancing nervously at Mrs. Holloway before looking back at Elijah. "You didn't realize what?" Elijah asked, folding his arms. "That she's my mother? Or that every person who walks through those doors deserves respect, regardless of who they are?" Todd swallowed hard, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for an ally, but none of his co-workers moved to his defense. Even the manager, usually quick to intervene in tense situations, seemed rooted in place, watching the exchange with wide eyes. Elijah didn't wait for an answer. "I built this restaurant," he continued, his voice rising slightly but still controlled. "I built it on principles of excellence, of treating every guest like they matter. Because they do. And yet, here I am, standing in the middle of my own dining room, watching you make my mother feel invisible." Mrs. Holloway shifted slightly in her seat, her gaze now fixed on her son. Her lips pressed together in a small, almost imperceptible smile, a mix of pride and quiet gratitude. The tension in the room was palpable, but Elijah wasn't finished. He took a step back, his eyes scanning the room, addressing not just Todd, but everyone within earshot. "I've seen this kind of behavior before. Too many times. People making assumptions, acting as though someone's worth can be measured by the color of their skin, their age, or their perceived status. But not here. Not in this place." There was a murmur among the patrons, some nodding subtly, others looking down at their plates, uncomfortable but unable to look away. Todd, clearly flustered, began to stammer again. "I didn't mean to offend anyone. I was just busy and—" "Busy," Elijah interrupted, raising an eyebrow. Busy enough to chat with every other table, but not hers? He didn't wait for a response. Being busy isn't an excuse, it's a choice. And the choices you made today speak louder than any apology you might try to give now. The room seemed to hold its breath as Elijah turned his attention back to his mother. His voice softened, though it was still loud enough for everyone to hear. "I'm sorry, Mama. This is not what I built this place to be, and it will not happen again." Mrs. Holloway smiled gently, her eyes glistening. "You don't need to apologize for someone else's actions, Elijah," she said quietly, her voice carrying a warmth that seemed to ease the tension in the air. "You've already done more than enough." But Elijah wasn't ready to let the moment pass. He turned back to Todd, his expression unreadable. "We're going to have a conversation after this service," he said firmly. "In the meantime, you can go speak with the manager and let them decide if you're fit to stay on the floor tonight." Todd nodded hastily, mumbling something unintelligible before retreating toward the kitchen. His departure seemed to release some of the tension in the room, though the atmosphere remained heavy with unspoken questions. Elijah walked over to his mother's table and knelt beside her chair, his hand resting lightly on the edge of the table. "Are you okay?" he asked softly, his voice now filled with genuine concern. Mrs. Holloway reached out and placed her hand over his, her touch gentle but reassuring. "I'm fine, Elijah," she said. "I've been through worse, and I've raised you to stand up for what's right. You've made me proud today." Her words seemed to steady him, and for the first time since the confrontation began, a small smile appeared on Elijah's face. But even as he smiled, his mind was racing. This wasn't just about one incident or one waiter. It was about something bigger, about the culture he had worked so hard to create and the blind spots that had allowed this moment to happen. As Elijah rose to his feet, he noticed the way the other diners were looking at him and his mother. Some were filled with admiration, others with discomfort. But all of them had been witnesses to a moment that couldn't easily be forgotten. The pianist resumed his melody, filling the room with a soft, soothing tune. Slowly, conversations began to pick up again, though the energy of the room had undeniably shifted. Elijah leaned down to his mother once more. "Enjoy your meal, Mama," he said warmly. "It's on me tonight." Mrs. Holloway chuckled softly. "I should hope so," she replied with a wink. Elijah straightened and made his way back toward the bar, his mind already turning to the difficult conversations ahead. He knew this was far from over. Changes needed to be made, not just in how his staff was trained, but in how the values of his restaurant were upheld every single day. From her seat, Mrs. Holloway watched her son with quiet pride. She knew the weight he carried, the burden of trying to create something better in a world that often resisted change. And she also knew that Elijah had always been someone who rose to the challenge, someone who refused to let complacency win. As she turned her attention back to her menu, Mrs. Holloway couldn't help but smile. As the evening wore on, the hum of the restaurant slowly returned to normal. But it had also been a reminder of the strength the air still carried a subtle charge, to face the world, a reminder of what was and to demand better. Elijah moved as the night continued with practice. That strength would become checking on guests, everyone smoothing over any lingering whether they realized it or not. His charm was effortless, his presence commanding, but inside, his thoughts churned relentlessly. In the kitchen, Todd stood with his back against the wall, arms crossed tightly over his chest. His cheeks were still flushed, his mind replaying the scene over and over. He wasn't used to being called out like that, and certainly not in front of an entire restaurant. The shame stung more than he cared to admit, but mixed with it was a simmering resentment. Who did Elijah think he was, embarrassing him like that? Sure, Todd had made a mistake, but it wasn't as though he'd done it on purpose. The kitchen staff moved around him, pointedly avoiding eye contact. No one wanted to get caught in the crossfire of whatever fallout might come next. The manager, a wiry man named Carl, finally stepped into the room, his face set in a grim expression. "Todd," Carl said, his voice low but firm. "Elijah wants to see you in his office." Todd hesitated, his pride warring with the inevitability of the moment. "Am I fired?" he asked bluntly. Carl sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "That's up to Elijah. But if you want my advice, I'd say you need to own up to what happened. He's not unreasonable, but he doesn't tolerate excuses. Toad's stomach churned as he nodded reluctantly. He followed Carl through the bustling kitchen and up a narrow staircase to the small office tucked above the dining area. When he entered, Elijah was seated behind a sleek wooden desk, his fingers steepled in front of him. His expression was calm, but his eyes carried the same intensity that had silenced the dining room earlier. "Sit," Elijah said, gesturing to the chair across from him. Todd sat, his hands fidgeting in his lap. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched, heavy, and uncomfortable. "Do you know why you're here?" Elijah finally asked. Todd nodded slowly. "Because I messed up." Elijah tilted his head, studying him. "And what exactly does that mean? What do you think you messed up?" Todd hesitated, his throat dry. "I didn't treat your mother the way she deserved. I was distracted, and I didn't." "No," Elijah interrupted, his tone sharp. "This isn't about distractions. This is about choices. You chose to ignore her. You chose to treat her differently from the other guests, and I want to understand why." Todd swallowed hard, his palms sweating. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "It wasn't like I planned it. It just happened." Elijah leaned forward, his gaze piercing. "That's not good enough. This isn't just about my mother. It's about the culture we're building here. This restaurant is supposed to be a place where everyone feels welcome, where everyone is treated with respect. And what you did tonight undermined that." Toad's face burned with shame, but he forced himself to meet Elijah's eyes. "I'm sorry," he said, the words stumbling out awkwardly. "I didn't mean to disrespect her. I'll do better." Elijah nodded slowly, leaning back in his chair. "I hope you mean that," he said. "Because if this happens again, there won't be a second conversation." Todd nodded, relief flooding through him. "It won't," he promised. Elijah dismissed him with a wave, and Todd left the office feeling both chastened and strangely determined. He knew he had a lot to prove, not just to Elijah but to himself. Meanwhile, in the dining room, Mrs. Holloway continued to observe the subtle dynamics at play. She noticed the way the staff seemed to walk on eggshells around her, their smiles overly bright, their voices just a little too cheerful. It was as though they were trying to make up for Todd's behavior all at once. She appreciated the effort, but it also left her feeling slightly isolated, as if she were now under a microscope. Across the room, a couple at a nearby table whispered to each other, their eyes flicking toward her. Mrs. Holloway caught snippets of their conversation, the words powerful and graceful standing out. She sighed softly, her fingers tracing the edge of her wine glass. It wasn't the first time she'd been turned into a symbol, and she doubted it would be the last. Elijah returned to her table a few moments later, his expression softening as he approached. "How's everything, Mama?" he asked, his voice warm. Mrs. Holloway smiled up at him, her eyes twinkling. "The food is wonderful, as always," she said. "But you don't need to fuss over me, Elijah. I'm perfectly fine." Elijah pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, his shoulders relaxing slightly. "I know you are," he said, "but I still feel responsible. This place is my legacy, and I can't stand the thought of anyone walking in here and feeling less than." Mrs. Holloway reached across the table and placed her hand over his. "You're doing good work, Elijah," she said softly. "But you can't control every moment, every action. Sometimes people need to learn their own lessons, and sometimes those lessons come at a cost." Elijah nodded, his jaw tightening slightly. "I just don't want anyone to think I tolerate this kind of behavior. Not here, not anywhere." "And you've made that clear," Mrs. Holloway said. "But don't lose yourself in trying to fix what's broken in others. Focus on what you can control, the example you set, the culture you create. That's what will leave a lasting impact." Elijah sat back, her words sinking in. He knew she was right, that the weight of his responsibility still pressed heavily on him. This restaurant was more than just a business to him. It was a statement, a testament to his values and the legacy he hoped to build. As the night wound down, Mrs. Holloway watched her son return to his duties, his presence commanding and his resolve clear. She knew the challenges ahead wouldn't be easy, but she also knew that Elijah was more than capable of meeting them head-on. And as she took another sip of her wine, she couldn't help but feel a quiet sense of hope for him, for the restaurant, and for the future they were building together. The restaurant was winding down for the night, but an undercurrent of unease still lingered. The staff moved with quiet efficiency, clearing tables and resetting the space for the next day. Elijah stood by the bar, scanning the room with a thoughtful expression. His mother had long since finished her meal and was now chatting with one of the servers, her warm laughter cutting through the tension like sunlight breaking through clouds. But Elijah's mind was elsewhere. He couldn't shake the feeling that tonight's events had struck a deeper chord than he was prepared to admit. It wasn't just about Todd's behavior, it was about what it represented. Despite all his efforts to create a space that celebrated inclusivity and respect, tonight had shown him that cracks could still form, that biases and assumptions could seep in no matter how much he tried to guard against them. Todd, for his part, was keeping his head down, quietly wiping down the tables and avoiding eye contact with Elijah or Mrs. Holloway. He could feel the weight of the night pressing on him, each glance from a co-worker reminding him of his mistake. But what bothered him most was the way Elijah had looked at him, disappointed but not angry, as though Todd had let down something far bigger than just his boss. As the clock ticked closer to closing time, a sense of unease began to build. A group of late diners lingered in the corner booth, their conversation growing louder as they drained the last of their wine. Elijah watched them carefully, his instincts on high alert. Something about their energy felt off, their laughter carrying an edge that made the staff exchange nervous glances. At the same time, Mrs. Holloway prepared to leave. She stood, gathering her purse and wrapping a soft scarf around her shoulders. Elijah crossed the room to escort her. Before he could reach her, one of the diners in the corner booth raised his voice. "Hey, isn't that?" The man stopped, squinting in Mrs. Holloway's direction. His tone was loud enough to draw the attention of everyone in the room. Mrs. Holloway paused, a smile faltering as the group's attention turned to her. Elijah felt a knot form in his stomach. He stepped closer to his mother, his protective instincts kicking in. The man stood up, his movements unsteady. "I know you," he said, pointing at Mrs. Holloway with a triumphant grin. "You're, what's her name? The lady from all those stories, the one with the big deal son." Elijah's jaw tightened as the man's words slurred together, a mix of recognition and alcohol-induced bravado. The rest of the group laughed nervously, trying to pull him back to his seat, but he waved them off. Mrs. Holloway straightened her posture, her expression calm but guarded. "You must have me mistaken for someone else," she said politely, her voice steady. No, the man insisted, stumbling toward her. "You're somebody important, right? Like big-time important. Why are you even here? Shouldn't you be in some fancy place?" Elijah stepped in front of his mother, his voice firm, but measured. "Sir, I think you've had enough for tonight. Let me call you a car." The man blinked, swaying slightly as he focused on Elijah. "Oh, so you're her son, huh? Big shot running this place, huh? Well, let me tell you something." Enough, Elijah said, his tone sharp. The room had gone silent, all eyes on the unfolding scene. Todd watched from the corner, frozen in place. He could see the tension in Elijah's shoulders, the way his jaw clenched. The man laughed, throwing his hands up in mock surrender. "Relax, I'm just messing around. No harm, no foul." But his words carried a mocking edge that set Elijah's teeth on edge. Mrs. Holloway placed a gentle hand on Elijah's arm, her touch calming him slightly. "It's all right, Elijah," she said softly. "Let's not make a scene." But the man wasn't done. No, I get it," he said, backing toward his table. "You're all about respect and dignity and all that good stuff. Real noble, real inspiring." He smirked, his tone dripping with sarcasm. Elijah's fists clenched at his sides, but he forced himself to stay composed. "I think it's time for you to go," he said evenly. The man hesitated, as if weighing whether to push further, but his friends finally pulled him toward the door, muttering apologies as they passed. The tension in the room remained thick even after they left, the quiet hum of conversation not quite returning to normal. Elijah exhaled slowly, his hands relaxing. He turned to his mother, his voice softening. "I'm sorry, Mama. That shouldn't have happened." Mrs. Holloway shook her head, her eyes filled with understanding. "It's not your fault, Elijah. People will be people, no matter where you are." But Elijah couldn't shake the feeling that tonight had tested him in ways he hadn't anticipated. As he escorted his mother to her car, the weight of the evening pressed heavily on his shoulders. He knew the night wasn't over yet, not for him, and not for the questions that still lingered in his mind. Back inside, Todd stood near the bar, his gaze fixed on Elijah. For the first time he saw the man not just as his boss, but as someone carrying an immense burden, a responsibility to his family, his community, and the values he had built this place upon. And for the first time, Todd began to understand the gravity of his own actions, the ripple effect they had created. The restaurant lights dimmed as the last of the guests departed, leaving Elijah standing alone in the quiet space. The echoes of the night played in his mind, each moment a reminder of the challenges that lay ahead. And as he looked out over the empty dining room, he felt a flicker of determination rise within him. The night had tested him, but the story wasn't over yet. As Elijah stood in the quiet dining room, his reflection in the window caught his attention. The faint outline of his own figure felt almost like a stranger, someone burdened by the weight of the evening's events. He exhaled deeply, his breath fogging the glass momentarily. Just as he was about to turn off the lights and lock up, his phone buzzed on the counter. He picked it up, expecting a routine message, or perhaps a check-in from one of the staff. Instead, it was a text for an unknown number. ****, you don't know the half of it. Check the books. ****. Elijah frowned, the cryptic message immediately putting him on edge. The books. He thought of the restaurant's records, meticulously kept to ensure every detail of the business was accounted for. Was this some kind of prank? Or worse, a veiled threat? He glanced around the empty space, his instincts telling him to follow through. Making his way to the office, he unlocked the drawer containing the restaurant's financial ledgers and digital files. Everything looked as it should, organized and intact. But something about the text gnawed him. He couldn't ignore it. Pulling up the recent transactions on the computer, Elijah began scrolling through the entries. At first, nothing seemed out of place. But as he dug deeper, a pattern began to emerge. Small, irregular deductions spread out over months. Amounts so minor they could have easily been overlooked. They added up, though, and the sum was enough to make Elijah's heart race. Whoever had sent that text knew something he didn't, and someone within his own team had been siphoning money. The weight of this realization hit him like a freight train. It wasn't just about the money. It was about trust, about the people he had carefully chosen to work in the space that meant so much to him and his mother. And yet, someone had betrayed that trust in the worst way possible. Elijah's thoughts immediately went to Todd. Could it be him? After tonight's behavior, the possibility wasn't hard to entertain. But Elijah also knew he couldn't jump to conclusions. Whoever was responsible had gone to great lengths to cover their tracks. This wasn't impulsive. It was calculated. The door to the office creaked open slightly, and Elijah spun around to see Todd standing hesitantly in the doorway. His face was pale, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. "I didn't mean to interrupt," Todd said quickly, his voice unusually subdued. Elijah studied him carefully, the tension from earlier still hanging between them. "What do you need?" he asked, keeping his tone neutral. Todd hesitated, as if weighing his next words. I wanted to apologize for everything tonight. I was out of line and I know I messed up. I've been going through some stuff, but that's no excuse." Elijah leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "It's not just about tonight, Todd. It's about what this place stands for. If you can't see that, maybe this isn't the right fit for you." Toad's face fell, but he nodded slowly. "I understand. I wanted to make it right. If there's anything I can do. Before Elijah could respond, his phone buzzed again. He glanced down at the screen. Asterisk, asterisk, it's closer than you think. Look at the names. Asterisk, asterisk. Elijah's pulse quickened as he turned back to the records. The deductions had been labeled under routine expenses, but as he cross-referenced them with the employee payroll list, something clicked. The same name appeared over and over, an employee who had left months ago under mysterious circumstances. Someone who had trained others, including Todd. The realization struck him like lightning. The theft wasn't just about money. It was about planting seeds of doubt and chaos, about tearing apart the trust and unity he had worked so hard to build. And whoever had sent the text knew exactly how to tip him off without revealing their identity. Elijah turned back to Todd, his expression unreadable. You said you wanted to make things right. Todd nodded, his brow furrowed in confusion. Good, Elijah said. Because I'm going to need your help to figure out who's been stealing from us. Todd's eyes widened, a mixture of shock and indignation crossing his face. Stealing? Wait, you think I don't know what to think yet. Elijah interrupted. But if you really want to prove you belong here, this is your chance. Todd hesitated, but something in Elijah's tone left no room for argument. What do you need me to do? He asked finally. Elijah handed him a printout of the flagged transactions. Start with these. Look for anything that stands out, patterns, connections, anything. As Todd sat down to comb through the data, Elijah's thoughts raced. He didn't know who he could trust anymore, but one thing was clear. This wasn't just about the money. Someone was trying to send a message, and he wasn't about to let them win. The night stretched on as they worked side by side in tense silence. Every click of the keyboard, every rustle of paper added to the weight in the room. And as the pieces began to fall into place, Elijah couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the brink of uncovering something much bigger than they had anticipated. But the more they uncovered, the clearer it became that this wasn't the work of one person. It was part of something larger and more insidious. And as the clock ticked toward dawn, Elijah realized that the real battle was only just beginning. The dim glow of the office lamp cast long shadows across the room as Elijah and Todd pored over the evidence. Their exhaustion was palpable, but adrenaline kept them sharp. Todd leaned closer to the screen, his finger hovering over a name that appeared again and again, hidden within the flagged transactions. Here, Todd said, breaking the silence. This name, Samantha Green. She left before I'd even started working here, right? Elijah nodded, his stomach tightening. Samantha had been a trusted employee, someone who had worked closely with his mother before she stepped away from the restaurant. She had left suddenly, claiming personal reasons, and Elijah had never thought to question it. But why would her name still be tied to recent transactions? Todd asked, his voice a mix of confusion and suspicion. Elijah didn't have an answer, but the pieces of the puzzle were starting to align in his mind. Samantha had access to their financial systems, training others on how to use them. Could she have created a backdoor into their accounts before she left? And if so, why? Just as he was about to respond, a loud knock echoed through the restaurant, startling them both. Elijah stood, his heart racing. No one should have been there at this hour. He cautiously made his way to the front door, Todd following close behind. Through the glass, Elijah could make out the figure of a woman, her face obscured by the shadows of the streetlight. She knocked again, her movements urgent. Elijah opened the door a crack. Can I help you? The woman stepped into the light, revealing a face Elijah hadn't seen in over a year. It was Samantha. We need to talk, she said, her voice low but firm. Elijah stepped aside, letting her in. Todd hovered in the background, watching the exchange with wide eyes. Samantha wasted no time. I know you've been digging into the accounts, she said, glancing at the office. I figured it was only a matter of time before you noticed. You're the one who's been stealing from us, Elijah said, his voice heavy with betrayal. Samantha shook her head. It's not that simple. Then explain, Elijah demanded, crossing his arms. Samantha sighed, running a hand through her hair. When I left, I thought I was done with this place, but someone else wasn't. A man named Carl. He's connected to the investors your mom originally worked with to start this restaurant. He approached me, said he knew about the financial issues the restaurant had been through, and offered me money to keep quiet about things I didn't even fully understand. Elijah's stomach churned. What are you talking about? Samantha hesitated. Your mom didn't just step away from the restaurant, Elijah. She was pushed out. Carl and his people wanted to turn this place into something more profitable, something that didn't align with the vision your mom had. When she refused, they started manipulating the accounts to make it look like the restaurant was struggling more than it actually was. I was just a pawn. I didn't realize how deep it went until I was in too far. Elijah felt like the ground had been pulled out from under him. His mother had always been vague about her reasons for stepping back, but he had never imagined this. So you've been helping them? Elijah asked, his voice cold. No, Samantha said quickly. After I left, I tried to undo what I could. That's why you're seeing my name in the transactions. I was trying to reroute the money back into the accounts without them noticing. But they caught on, and now they're coming after me. That's why I'm here. I need your help, Elijah. Elijah stared at her, torn between anger and confusion. He wanted to believe her, but the betrayal was still fresh. You expect me to trust you after everything you just admitted? He asked. I expect you to care about the truth, Samantha shot back. Your mom built this place with her heart and soul. Don't let them take it away. Todd, who had been silent until now, stepped forward. If what she's saying is true, we need to act fast. They could already be planning their next move. Elijah's mind raced. The restaurant was more than just a business. It was his family's legacy. He couldn't let it fall into the hands of people who didn't care about its values. Fine, he said finally, his voice firm. But if we're doing this, we're doing it my way. No more secrets. Samantha nodded, relief flickering across her face. I'll tell you everything I know. As the three of them sat down to strategize, the tension in the room was palpable. Samantha revealed more about Carl's plans, his connections, and the lengths he was willing to go to seize control of the restaurant. Elijah realized they were up against more than just financial manipulation. They were facing a calculated attempt to dismantle everything his family had built. But just as they were forming a plan, Samantha's phone buzzed on the table. She glanced at the screen and froze, her face going pale. What is it? Elijah asked. She turned the phone toward him, showing a message for an unknown number. Asterisk, asterisk. You're not as clever as you think. We're already one step ahead. Asterisk, asterisk. Elijah's blood ran cold. The battle wasn't just starting, it was already underway.